By the light of a single tallow candle, Rebecca Stark drew the thing out of her husband's chest with her own 2 fingers. And when she saw what it was, her hands went still as stone. It had been buried in the old scar 20 years, grown over, walled in, carried up and down the high mountains across 10,000 miles of trapline by a man who never once knew it was there. It was small, and it was hard, and it had been shaped by a human hand, and not by any beast nor any act of God. And in the moment Rebecca understood what she was holding, she understood everything else along with it. Who her scarred husband truly was. What the whole of Elk Bend had gotten dead wrong about him for 20 years. And exactly which respectable man in that town was going to have to answer for it at last. She wrapped it in a clean cloth. She did not yet know that it would empty a church. Before I tell you what she pulled out of that wound, and I promise you the whole town gasped when they learned it, do one thing for me. If you have ever been judged for the look of you before a single soul troubled to learn your heart, then you already understand both of these people better than all of Elk Bend ever did. Subscribe to this channel and stay with me to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to the spring it all began. To the cruel Bet that married a scarred trapper, to the one woman in that town that nobody else would have. It began, as cruelty so often does, as a joke among men with whiskey in them. Amos Stark came down out of the high country to Elk Bend twice a year, spring and fall, to trade his winter furs at Bram Crandall's post, and twice a year the town treated his coming like a traveling show. He was a big man, gone to silence and beard. And the left side of his face and neck was a ruin of old scar, melted and seamed, the legacy of a thing the town had decided long ago that it knew the truth of. That 20 years back, out on a lonesome claim, a strange young man had been the only living soul left standing among the murdered. And that strange young men do not survive what they did not cause. They called him the Stark Beast. Children were frightened by his name. He bore it the way he bore the weather, and said nothing, and went back up his mountain. This spring, the men loafing on Crandall's porch made a wager of him. They bet, loud enough for the whole street to hear, that the beast could not get himself a wife, not a woman in the territory, not even, Bram Crandall said, laughing, the only creature in Elk Bend as lonesome as he was. Rebecca Fry, the healer's daughter, 32 and unmarried. A big plain woman the town had long since set up on the shelf and forgotten. They named her into their joke to make it sharper. They did not trouble to lower their voices, for it had never once occurred to a one of them that she might be a person who could hear. Rebecca Fry had spent 32 years keeping her face still while men decided what she was worth. She was done with it. She crossed that street in front of the whole laughing porch, and she stood square in front of the scarred giant who had gone rigid with the old shame of being made sport of. And she said it plain enough for every soul there to hear. I can cook, and I can keep a house, and I can heal most of what ails a body. And I have buried both my parents, and I am not afraid of one thing left in this world. You need a wife, and I am through being a punchline. Marry me, Mr. Darsh, Mrs. Stark, and we will make liars of every man on that porch. Amos Stark looked at her a long moment out of his ruined face. Then he said the first word the town had heard out of him in years. Yes. They were wed within the hour by a startled circuit preacher, and Rebecca Fry became Rebecca Stark. And she packed her mother's healing kit and her few good things, and went up the mountain with a man the whole world called a monster, on a dare to a cabin she had never seen. Certain of one thing only, that whatever waited for her up there, it could not be lonelier than the town she was leaving behind. The cabin sat high in a fold of the mountains, a half-day's hard climb above Elk Bend. And it was not the lair the town's stories had promised. It was small and spare and scrupulously kept. A trapper's cabin, every tool hung in its place, the floor swept, the pelts stretched and graded with a care that spoke of a man who had nothing in the world to tend but his work, and tended it well. He had not expected to bring a woman to it. He stood in the doorway as though he did not rightly know how to let her past him. And Rebecca understood, watching him, that the hardest thing in the world for Amos Stark was not her seeing his cabin. It was her seeing him by daylight, up close, with nowhere for the scar to hide. She looked at it. She did not flinch, and she did not soften her face into pity, which is its own kind of insult. She looked at the ruin of his face the way she looked at any wound, as a thing that had happened to a person, and not the person himself. "That's an old burn under the cut," she said, in her flat healer's way. "And it never healed right underneath, did it? You favor that side. It pains you still." It was not a question, and the look he gave her was the look of a man who had gone 20 years without one living soul asking after his hurt instead of recoiling from it. It was the dog that told her the rest. There was a wolfish gray dog with one milk-blind eye that came down off the woodpile and leaned its whole weight against the scarred man's leg. And Amos Stark's ruined face changed entirely when he put his hand down to it, went gentle, went young, went human. "Found him in a trap with his leg near off," Amos said, low, as though confessing a thing. "Couldn't leave him." And Rebecca Stark, who had married a monster on a dare, looked at the man who could not bring himself to leave a maimed dog to die in the snow, and thought, "They have got him wrong. They have got him entirely wrong." She did not say it. She set down her mother's kit, and she rolled up her sleeves, and she set about making a home of the place, because that was a thing she knew how to do, and because a body has to start somewhere. What Rebecca Stark understood, that the whole of Elk Bend in 20 years had not, was that the surest way to learn the truth of a man is to feed him and watch. She began with bread, because she began everything with bread, and the smell of it filled that spare cabin for the first time in its history. And Amos Stark came in off his trapline that first evening and stopped dead in the doorway at the scent of it, like a man walking straight into a memory. He ate what she set before him the way a starved animal eats, fast and watchful, and then caught himself, ashamed, and made himself go slow, and she pretended not to see it and cut him more. A man who eats like that, she knew, has not been cooked for by another living soul in a very long time. She set herself to fixing that one meal at a time, and the gauntness went out of him by midsummer. And he took to lingering at the table after, in the lamplight, not saying a great deal, just plainly unwilling to let the evening end. She learned the size of his gentleness slow, in pieces. She saw it in the dog, and in the way he handled the spring kits in the traps he would not set, having quietly given up the cruelest part of his trade years before and never told a soul. She saw it the one time they went down to the post for powder and salt, when a small girl of the town, too young yet to have learned to be afraid, toddled straight up to the Stark beast and held up a fistful of crushed wildflowers, and the whole street went silent and braced itself for the monster. And Amos Stark went down on one knee in the dust and took the flowers from the child as gravely as if they had been gold, and gave her in trade a little carved fox out of his coat pocket, the kind of thing a man carves by firelight through a long winter alone. The child laughed. The town did not know where to put its eyes. Rebecca did. She looked at her husband. There came a night that neither of them spoke of afterward, though both of them kept it, A storm had pinned them in, and they sat close by the one fire for the warmth of it. And Amos Stark said into the dark, not looking at her, the longest thing he had yet said to her. "You married me despite a porch full of fools. I know that. You owe me nothing past the keeping of the house. And if you want, come spring, to go back down and be quit of me, I'll see you safe down the mountain and not say a word against it." Rebecca was a long while answering. "I married you despite them," she agreed. "That was the start of it. Then, because she had spent her whole life being honest and saw no cause to quit now, it isn't the whole of it anymore." Amos Stark did not answer that, but he reached over, slow, the way a man reaches toward a thing he is half afraid will vanish if he touches it, and laid his scarred hand over her plain one on the bench between them. And neither of them moved it again the whole rest of that long night. But all the while the old wound was turning against him. She had seen it that first day, and through the summer she watched it worsen, the scarred side hot to the touch, the skin over the breastbone gone tight and angry, and Amos waking in the night with fevers he would not name. She knew mortification when she smelled it, the sweet rot of a body poisoning itself, and she knew that something underneath that 20-year-old scar had never come clean, had been walled away and festering the whole time, and was now, after 2 full decades, finally going to kill him if it was not cut out. When she told him so, plain, he only looked at her with a strange and exhausted relief, the look of a man who has carried a thing too long and would not altogether mind setting it down, whatever the cost. "Leave it," he said at first. "It's carried me this far." But the fevers climbed, and the night came at last, when he could not rise from the bed, and Rebecca Stark laid out her mother's blades by the light of a single candle and understood 2 things at once: that she was about to cut 20 years of poison out of the man she had somehow come to love, and that she did not, for one single moment, believe the thing the town said he had done. She gave him what whiskey there was and a strap of leather to bite, and she opened the old wound by candlelight while the one-eyed dog whined in the corner. It was worse beneath than above, a deep old track that had closed over its own filth and never drained. And down at the bottom of 20 years of scar, her fingers found the thing the candle had promised, small and hard and shaped by a hand. She drew it out. She wiped it clean, and by that one flame, she saw that she was holding the broken-off tip of a knife blade. 3 inches of good steel snapped clean across and stamped into the steel near the break, a maker's mark and 2 initials, worn but readable. B.C. Amos Stark. Gray and shaking on the bed, looked at the thing in her hand, and the silence of 20 years broke open in him all at once. He had been 18, he told her, the words coming rough and long unpracticed. He had a mother then, and 2 little sisters, on a claim 2 valleys north, and one night a young road agent had come for the gold. His dead father had left them, and when Amos fought him for it, the man had cut him to the bone of his face and driven the blade into his chest and snapped it off there against the breastbone, and left him for dead in the doorway. The agent had killed the rest, his mother, both the girls, and taken the gold and gone. Amos had crawled out alive into a country that took one look at the strange burned boy standing alone among his slaughtered family and decided he had done it himself. No one would believe him. He had been 18 and disfigured and grieving and entirely alone. And so in time he had stopped trying to be believed and gone up into the high country and let them call him whatever they pleased for 20 years, because it had never seemed to matter much who believed a monster. "I never knew his name," Amos whispered. "I never laid eyes on him again. I only knew I'd left a piece of his knife inside me, and I couldn't even prove that, because I could never get at it. Rebecca Stark held the broken blade up to the candle and the two stamped initials, and she said very quietly, "The thing that changed everything. I know whose this is. Amos. I know that knife. I have seen its mate hanging behind the counter at the trading post, broken across in the very same place, these 20 years. It belongs to Bram Crandall." For a long moment, neither of them breathed, because they both understood in the same instant what it meant. That the man who had murdered Amos Stark's family and ruined his face and stolen 20 years of his one life was not some nameless rider gone forever into the dark. He was the richest, most respected, most pious man in Elk Bend. The deacon who passed the plate of a Sunday. The very man who had stood on his own porch that spring and made a cruel joke of the marriage that had now, against every odd in the world, undone him. And a man like that does not let two nobodies on a mountain keep the proof of his hanging. They had only until he learned of it. They both knew they had to reach the law and the town before Bram Crandall could reach them. It was very near too late as it stood. A boy from the post had hauled supplies partway up the trail twice that summer, and had seen the trapper's wife studying the broken knife behind Crandall's counter on her last trip down for salt, studying it the way you study a thing you mean to remember. And a careful man like Bram Crandall, with 20 years of a secret to keep, notices when a nobody takes too long an interest in the one object on earth that can hang him. He had begun to watch the mountain, so Rebecca did not go openly down to any marshal. She sent the message folded inside a packet of furs with a trapper she trusted. Bound for the territorial seat, and she timed their own coming down for a Sunday, when Crandall would be boxed in his own front pew before the whole congregation and could neither run quiet nor silence her unseen. She had doctored bodies her whole life. It turned out she understood a fair deal, too, about how to corner a guilty one. They came down the mountain on a Sunday, because that was the one day the whole of Elk Bend could be found together in a single room. And they walked into the church in the middle of the service. The stark beast, gray and weak and leaning on the arm of the big plain wife the town had laughed about. The two creatures Elk Bend had set at the very bottom of itself, and the singing died away to nothing. Bram Crandall sat in the front pew, deacon's ribbon and all. Rebecca Stark walked up the aisle past every staring face and laid a small clean cloth upon the communion rail and opened it, and held up to the whole congregation the 3 inches of broken blade she had cut out of her husband's chest the week before. 20 years ago, a man murdered the Stark family up on the North Claim, she said, and her healer's voice carried flat and clear to the back wall. And he left a piece of his knife in the only boy who lived. Here it is. It bears his mark and his initials, and it matches, to the very break, the broken knife that has hung behind the counter at this man's trading post for 20 years. Where half of you have seen it 100 times and never once thought to wonder why a careful man keeps a ruined blade. She turned and looked at Bram Crandall. You didn't keep it out of carelessness. You kept it because you could never find the missing piece. Well, Amos Stark carried it out of that doorway in his own body, and he has carried it ever since. And here it is at last. The church was utterly silent. And then Amos Stark spoke for only the second time the town had ever heard, and he told it plain: the night, the gold, his mother and his 2 small sisters, the blade. And as he spoke, Bram Crandall's respectable face came apart at the seams in front of every soul who had ever trusted him, because guilt, 20 years buried, still knows its own name when at last it is spoken aloud. He bolted for the door and found the circuit marshal already standing in it, for Rebecca had not come down off that mountain without sending word ahead. They took Bram Crandall away in irons through a town that could not find a single word to say. And the people of Elk Bend, who had warned their children by a scarred and gentle man for 20 years, stood in their pews and looked at the monster they had made of him, and understood, far too late, exactly what they had done to a boy who had only ever tried to save his family. And there was not one of them whose face was fit to be seen. The wound healed clean once the poison was out of it, the first time in 20 years it had been let to, and the fevers never came back. Amos Stark's face was a ruin still, and always would be. But a strange thing happened to it in Elk Bend after that Sunday. People who had crossed the street to keep clear of the beast began to nod to him, and then to speak to him. And the children who had been frightened by his name took, in the way of children, to following him about and begging to see the carved foxes and owls that came out of his pockets. And the scar that had marked him, a monster came slowly, to mark him instead as the man who had survived what no boy ever should and stayed gentle through the whole of it. It is a thing a town can do when it is good and ashamed. It can learn. They had been married on a dare, and they stayed married for love, which is a sturdier foundation than most marriages are built on, and was certainly sturdier than a bet made on a porch. Rebecca Stark doctored the whole of that high country for the rest of her days, and there was no cabin too far up any mountain for her to climb to when a body needed her. And Amos went along on the hard ones and carried her kit and waited outside in the cold, the way a man does who has finally come into something he is afraid to lose. In time, there were children in that cabin who had Amos's quiet and Rebecca's plain stubborn courage, and a one-eyed dog grown old by the fire, and the small carved animals lined up along every sill, a whole wilderness of them. Years on, a young woman of Elk Bend, ashamed to be marrying a man the town reckoned beneath her, climbed up the mountain to ask the healer whether she was a fool to do it. Rebecca Stark, who had been called the loneliest creature in the territory, and a punchline, and a fool herself for marrying a monster on a dare, looked at the girl and gave her the truest thing she owned. "Folks will tell you what a person is worth by the look of them," she said. "They are wrong about near every soul I have ever met. And they were most wrong of all about the two people they laughed at hardest. Marry the heart, child. The look of a thing was never once the truth of it." She had been judged her whole life by the outside of her, and so had he. And the both of them had turned out to be exactly the thing the world had sworn they could never be, wanted and worthy and home. So that is what the healer found in the scarred trapper's old wound. Not only a piece of a murderer's knife, but the whole buried truth of a good man, walled up and waiting 20 years for the one person who would trouble to look past the scar and dig for it. The church that day was emptied of every word it had, and neither Amos nor Rebecca Stark was ever again, to the end of their long lives together, mistaken for a thing of no account. And she stayed.